Ontario Premier Bob Rae's pre-election promises to people with disabilities got little attention in this week's speech from the throne, but hopes are high that the NDP leader Rae will keep his word. Hello and welcome to another edition of DNet, Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit.
And I'm Joe Coughlin. People with disabilities had high expectations for Ontario's Throne Speech, the first given by an NDP government in the province. We'll hear a reaction to the speech later in the show.
And as we saw last week, people with disabilities have many hidden costs. Today we'll take a look at how the burden of those expenses could be lifted by tax breaks.
And we'll catch up on letters from viewers. But first, here's this week's roundup of disability stories from across the country.
Disabled people in Ontario found little to cheer about when the province's NDP government unveiled its intentions earlier this week. Premier Bob Rae's pre-election commitments on such matters as employment equity were not reflected in the throne speech delivered by Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander. In the speech, the word disability came up only once, in one short sentence.
Reports on advocacy for Ontario's most vulnerable citizens, the disabled and the frail elderly, have been gathering dust for too long. We will deal with this issue.
Representatives of disability groups who believe the Rae government is sincerely interested in their concerns are adopting a wait-and-see attitude. Some, like Ross Robinson of the Ontario Advisory Council for Disabled Persons, found the throne speech vague.
Like any throne speech, it was a little on the vague side, but I was encouraged by the reference to employment equity, to the fact that we are going to pay attention to some of the reports on issues relating to disability and the frail elderly. The implementation of the SARC report, which includes many provisions of special importance to people with disabilities. So, yeah, I found some encouragement in it.
The SARC report is a detailed look at the social assistance system in Ontario. It includes specific recommendations for overhauling the system. We'll talk with Robinson and another disabled rights activist later in the program.
A coalition of disability organizations, Disabled People for Employment Equity, is going to federal court. It hopes that a court order will force Employment and Immigration Minister Barbara McDougall to require employers to comply with the Employment Equity Act. David Baker, a lawyer representing the coalition, says that the abuse of the act is common and that the 5 major banks are among the biggest offenders.
4 of the 5 national banks have chosen to disregard the definition of disability provided under the regulation, and in particular, to do away with the requirement that they ask employees when they identify themselves as being disabled or not, whether or not they're limited in work. They have removed that provision from the employment equity questionnaires.
The coalition charges that by broadening the definitions of disability, banks are inflating the statistics without actually hiring more disabled employees. In some cases, they have less disabled persons on staff while their overall numbers are up. Canadian Bankers Association spokesperson Joanne De Laurentiis says that a broader definition was needed to account accurately for all disabled people on staff.
So they discovered they were really undercounting just because of the way that they had asked the question. Secondly, the other problem has been one of identification. It is a self-identification process, as you know, so the individual who gets the questionnaire says, yes, this is where I fit in, or no, this is where I don't fit in.
When you are blind, getting a taxi often involves a lot more than just picking up a phone and calling a cab. As this story from Montreal shows, it can involve risking your neck.
When Ron Pelche and his wife called a cab a couple of weeks ago, they didn't expect the driver to lock the doors when he arrived. But that's exactly what happened. The cabbie took one look at the guide dogs and refused the fare.
And he said, "No way, I'm leaving." And in an effort to stop him, I sat on the fender of the car, and to my great surprise, he took off and drove me partly around NDG on the hood of his vehicle.
The taxi headed east on Sherbrooke Street with Pelche lying on the hood, clutching the antenna. The cabbie, who works for Diamond, ended up being charged with reckless driving and refusing a ride to the blind. But the second offense only carries a $65 fine.
There's no reason why Montreal should have $65 fine when Ontario has $1,000. You can see where the law is going to be obeyed very quickly.
Some of the blind say 2 out of 3 cabs refuse to stop for them.
The minute they see the dog, they'll just speed up and keep on going again, and maybe 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 taxis will do this before maybe one will decide to stop and pick us up.
I know there are a couple that refuse, but I'd say that 95% of the drivers will accept blind people and guide dogs.
The Association for the Blind is lobbying the government for stiffer fines. But it'll simply be too expensive for cab drivers to leave the blind behind. John Curtin, CBC News, Montreal.
Here's an update on our story last week dealing with the lack of disabled access at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. An Ontario Human Rights Commission spokesperson says that the Commission will file complaints against both Trent University and the Ministry of Colleges and Universities by the end of the month. In the meantime, James Neufeld, Vice President of the University Affairs at Trent, told DNet that they will cooperate with the Commission when the complaint is lodged. Neufeld said it is very difficult for a person with a disability to get around Trent.
Disabled veterans in the United States are questioning whether their government can provide adequate benefits and medical support to soldiers disabled in a Persian Gulf war. New legislation will cut $3.7 billion worth of benefits to the Veterans Administration. Rick Schultz of Disabled American Veterans says the U.S. government is cutting veteran benefits at the same time that they're asking men and women to sacrifice their lives.
The Advocacy Resource Center for the Handicapped is celebrating its first decade in operation. The Legal Clinic for Disability Issues marked the occasion at its annual awards event. The Human Rights Awards are given in recognition of those who have actively pursued the fight for disability rights. Ontario Premier Bob Rae was on hand to present an honorary Arch membership to legendary parliamentarian Stanley Knowles. Judge Sam Filer received the Lawyer Jurist Award. Filer, who has Lou Gehrig's disease, works from his home in a unique judicial capacity for the Ontario Court of Justice. David Revel, former Ontario MPP and activist for psychiatric issues, received the Arch Consumer Award. Revel has long advocated the empowerment of psychiatric survivors. And that's this week's roundup of disability news. Coming up next, disability advocates react to the Ontario Throne Speech.
As we heard in the news, people with disabilities in Ontario had high expectations for the Throne Speech drafted by Bob Rae's NDP government. Shortly after the speech was delivered by Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander, Joe spoke with 2 disability advocates.
Joining me now are David Baker and Ross Robinson. Baker is the Executive Director of the Advocacy Resource Center for the Handicapped, ARCH. Robinson is a member of the Ontario Advisory Council for Disabled Persons. Gentlemen, a quick reaction today to the Throne Speech. Mr. Robinson, let's start with you.
I found some encouragement in it. Like any Throne Speech, it was a little on the vague side, but I was encouraged by the reference to employment equity, to the fact that we are going to pay attention to some of the reports on issues relating to disability and the frail elderly. The implementation of the SARC report, which includes many provisions of special importance to people with disabilities. So, yeah, I found some encouragement in it.
Mr. Baker.
Mixed, very encouraged to hear them talking about advocacy for vulnerable adults. Again, as Ross has said, employment equity sounds promising, particularly since the Premier drafted a private member's bill, which from our perspective looks very, very good. I would have liked to have seen more specifics, albeit in a Throne Speech, on the SARC report. It was one sentence for a very important issue. And pleased to see on the auto insurance issue that they are considering not only reducing premiums, but also the quality of the compensation provided people who are disabled in auto accidents. But again, I'm disappointed perhaps slightly that they made no announcement of an examination of the universal disability insurance issue, which I think is the direction in which many of us would like to see things moving.
For the benefit of viewers across the country, can we sort of give them a thumbnail sketch of what the SARC report is all about?
Well, that was a detailed examination of the social assistance system in Ontario conducted several years ago, and it includes numerous recommendations that have to do with the improvement of the quality of the social assistance system to more effectively meet the needs of the working poor, those who are on welfare. And as I said before, many of its provisions affect the lives of those with disabilities.
The ultimate goal of the SARC report in the area of disability was the establishment of a comprehensive disability scheme, which again he had mentioned apparently to a Toronto Star reporter immediately after the election, but wasn't a theme that was picked up again in the Throne Speech. But we would hope that the review of auto insurance would lead to, I think necessarily would lead to an examination of that issue.
It was encouraging to see some movement towards the raising the minimum wage. I think that's something that affects many people with disabilities. I would have wished that the reference to improved rapid transit, public transit, might have included reference to full accessibility. Perhaps I'm reading a little bit of wishful thinking is there, and I'm endeavoring to read some commitments into that aren't really there, but my sense is that it was, generally speaking, a positive document.
Mr. Robinson, Mr. Baker, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan, when I was in the reporter's lockup just before the Throne Speech was read, Bob Rae gave a press conference. And the circumstances surrounding the lockup, I couldn't get into the press conference without climbing up a flight of stairs and then down a flight of stairs. So consequently, I didn't get a question in. And my view of the Premier was blocked by a lot of other reporters.
Not again.
Yeah, again, just like the last time. It would be really nice if at some point they expect people with disabilities to show up at these kinds of events and make it accessible.
The word cripple sends chills up the spines of many people with disabilities, and yet the C word keeps popping up in magazines and newspapers on a regular basis.
It's appeared in the Globe and Mail at least 3 times in the last few weeks, most recently in the sports section. A headline states that the crippled Argos prove they're not short on courage, and later on in the article calls the Argos the league's cripples. We asked consumer advocate Sandra Carpenter why she objects to the term.
Well, the first thing you have to remember about language is that language is always hooked with an evolution of attitude. The word cripple comes from a time when the attitude towards disabled people was predominantly one that was associated as, you know, poor so-and-so, like as in poor crippled Joey drags his way to school through the blinding snow, you know. It's kind of like, it makes me think of an archaic time when people associated anybody that had any kind of physical difference as somebody who was, you know, really suffering in some way, someone who was to be pitied. And that's what I think of when I think of the word cripple.
Susan, I don't mind it to be used to describe the word, you know, the economy or planes, trains, and automobiles, but when they start to use it to describe people, it's a little testy.
Yeah, let's keep it to inanimate objects.
Yeah, definitely. Coming up next, the high cost of disability, Part 2. In last week's show, we looked at the hidden cost of disability, cost that can be a very real barrier to employment for people with disabilities. Consumer advocate Vic Willey took me on a tour of several stores in Toronto's Eaton Centre to show me examples of some of those hidden costs. Food and medical expenses for guide dogs, electronic aids of all kinds, and drugs, the most expensive hidden cost for many disabled persons. Willey is the executive director of the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto. He uses a wheelchair because of a spinal cord injury. At his office, he's constantly reminded of the extraordinary costs of disability.
Well, for instance, my staff member, one of my staff members is registered blind. She has a guide dog. The guide dog costs $6,000. Now, it doesn't cost her $6,000, but someone has to pay for that. In addition, the dog, she has to keep the dog over its lifetime, which may be 10 years or 12 years. There are vet bills. It's going, tomorrow night I hear it's going to the vet, and it's going to cost $85 to have his teeth checked. She has to buy dog food. Now, this person lives in an apartment. She wouldn't normally have a dog, but he's a very nice dog, but she needs this dog just in order to go to the subway or to get work. So no matter which way you turn with a disability, you have to pay. Another one of my staff is hard of hearing. She has to buy batteries for her hearing aid. She also needs a special telephone, which can cost anywhere between $3,000 and $1,000. You know, she wants to record messages like everyone else at home. It's called the TDD. There is some recognition given to this in the income tax laws of the federal government, but it's a very small amount. It's less than $3,700 a year, and that is not income. That is taken off in a formalized way that really translate into a much smaller amount of income tax that you save.
Vic Willey's reference to income tax regulations brings us to our next guest. Greg Pick is with the Canadian Paraplegic Association, the CPA. Pick is spearheading the CPA's drive to get the tax regulations changed. They would like disabled people to be able to claim extraordinary expenses as tax deductions. You can claim a business lunch or the cost of your wife's secretary, but you can't claim the cost of your wheelchair. The CPA is attacking the issue on two fronts. It's talking with Minister of Finance Michael Wilson, and it's mounting a court challenge to the Income Tax Act based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Our view is that a disabled person, unlike able-bodied people, getting a job is like being in business, okay? And that accordingly, because of that, the disabled person should be able to write off these extraordinary expenses that non-disabled people, they don't face these expenses, so that they can write off those expenses.
Now, not everybody with a disability has medically related expenses. How about expenses with respect to employment and the kinds of things that they have to spend getting to and from work?
If we key on expenses of earning money, okay, and examine the whole aspect of the environment, what transportation systems are available, what are not. In essence, what we're saying is disabled people do not have the same flexibility for travel. They have higher expenses necessary to live and function independently. If these costs aren't offset, they can't work. If you don't have the proper medical expenses, medical supplies, your health is going to falter, your hygiene is going to suffer. So in other words, you need these things, not only to function independently and live healthy, but to fit into that social strata, to function in an independent work environment. So I would suspect that the problem facing the Minister of Finance right now and his officials is when we're going to analyze this, where do we put it? How do we put it in such a way, as you say, that the whole population doesn't start scurrying and pounding on the door saying, we want that treatment? And secondly, how are they going to enforce it in such a way that all of a sudden every person in Canada doesn't suddenly become disabled? You see, there's a lot of problems. It's enormously, enormously complex.
So complex that the CPA has no less than 7 lawyers and a professor of law working on the case. Pick told me it would take from 6 months to a year before the appropriate sections of tax law are even identified. He also pointed out that other consumer groups, not just the Canadian Paraplegic Association, are getting involved in the issue.
When we've looked at ramps over the last few weeks, we've been negative, negative, negative. Today we have a chance to be positive, positive, positive. Toronto Life magazine recently reviewed a ramp that they considered to be the best in the city.
They say while most ramps are horribly designed retrofits, bulky, steep structures that seem staple gunned on, the one at Scotia Plaza Tower shows how it should be done. Our unit manager, Joe Ross, went down and gave it the DNet acid test.
And here comes Joe, and as you can see, it's a nice even grade down, no problems. It's done by building code, and he comes up to these doors, and there's an automatic door opener, and he has no problem getting in, and apparently it's as nice inside and as well designed as it is out.
Well, it's good to see a ramp that doesn't lead to a flight of stairs like we have.
That's right, and you know, that ramp's really great for just anybody, for people with strollers that have babies, for people that are pushing carts and boxes, and as I mentioned, it's built to the building code so that it's perfect. I think that the inside of the plaza also is meritable. The elevator door, or the elevator knobs, are down where people in a wheelchair can reach them, and it's just all in all A1.
Here they get some non-slip floors, and for people like me on crutches too that don't slide all over the place.
As we saw earlier, Joe Ross didn't have any trouble controlling his wheelchair going down the ramp on his way into the building. And while he might have had difficulty going up a steeper ramp, he said this one was no problem. And just watch him here, he just zips right up there, and it was quite easy for him, he said. So it's nice to see some people working smarter, not harder.
Right on. Coming up, Talking Computers.
Not long ago, people who were blind had a difficult time accessing information stored on a computer. A definite drawback for those looking for work in a modern office. John Stuart Vandenberg, who is blind, showed me one solution to the problem.
What this actually is an absolutely standard microcomputer that happens to be tied into the network that we use here with this ministry. So I'm actually able to communicate directly with over 3,000 fellow employees. So the way it actually works is that there's a voice added to it. So if I want to find out what's on the screen, I can... Okay. So I know that that is basically a blank screen.
How does it work?
Well, it somehow takes the information that is sent to the screen of the computer and feeds that through a circuit that eventually, I guess, pronounces it in the voice.
How does it help you?
Well, it basically gives me access to any document that's produced on computer, either through the electronic network, so most of the interoffice memoranda come to me on this computer, and I can just simply read them on the screen, because anything that shows up on the screen, I can read with the voice. This particular unit is actually made up of two pieces. One is this little keyboard that runs the voice, and then the actual voice pronouncer, if you will, or what they call the voice synthesizer that sits over here. The keyboard unit is about $800 and the voice is about $1,300.
As part of the mandate of this branch, I appreciate your cooperation in completing these forms as they are necessary for accurate documentation.
John Stuart Vandenberg works for the Program Technology Branch of the Ontario Ministry of Community and Social Services.
Interesting tool for blind people who work in the office. But what if you have to listen to something that's strictly confidential?
I knew you'd ask that. Actually, you can stop the voice automatically, and you can plug in the headphones. Okay, and that brings us to technology and letters. We've got two letters this week, one on technology, and this first one, though, is from Mrs. Addie DeGraff of Manitoba in response to our immigration story. I am the foster parent of 2 Down syndrome children. Canada makes sure that special needs children do not enter this country, even if it means splitting up families. This is a very outdated rule. A child or adult with Down syndrome is one of the most pleasant, harmless, and affectionate persons you can have around, and most can be trained to live a full life of self-worth and quality. Thanks a lot for your letter.
And here are some folks who wrote in asking for information on the wheelchair lift conversion for 4-wheel drive vehicles. Dan Boucher of Toronto, Henry Enns of Winnipeg, and Neil McLeod of Moxville, Ontario. It seemed to be a popular item, and we'll be responding to these letters soon.
You can write to us at the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or fax us at 416-975-5636.
And that's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. We'll see you again next week.